Hello everyone, tonight we journey back to an age where the unknown stretched beyond the horizon, where maps ended in dragons, and the edge of the world was a very real, terrifying concept. But what if the greatest discovery in human history wasn't a triumph of accurate science or enlightened exploration, but born from a colossal, almost absurd miscalculation? What if one man's unwavering, borderline obsessive belief in a fundamentally flawed premise reshaped the entire planet, giving birth to a world he never intended to find? This isn't the sanitized history you learned in school. This is the tale of an insane gamble, fueled by ambition, desperation, and a stubborn refusal to admit error. This is the story of Christopher Columbus, and how one simple miscalculation created a new continent. A continent that, for him, was merely an inconvenient obstacle on his path to a destination he was absolutely certain he knew. Stay with us. If you enjoy delving into the hidden currents of history, please subscribe and hit that like button. It truly helps us bring more untold stories to light. Now, our story begins not on a ship, but in the stifling, labyrinthine halls of power, where a man named Cristoforo Colombo, a Genoese mariner, was relentlessly pursuing a dream that most considered a fool's errand. For years, he had been an itinerant supplicant, his voice hoarse from pleading, his spirit bruised by rejection. His proposal was audacious, almost blasphemous, to reach the fabled riches of the East, Fay the Spice Islands. Cathay, Cipango Fay, not by sailing around Africa, a route monopolized by Portugal, but by sailing west, directly across the vast, terrifying Atlantic. "The world is round," he declared, a truth most educated men of the age now accepted. Therefore one can reach the East by sailing. But his calculations were anything but simple, and therein lay the seed of an epic, world-altering blunder. Columbus, a man driven by a singular, unyielding vision, had convinced himself that the earth was far smaller than it actually was. He cherry-picked ancient texts, misread Arabic astronomical tables, and conveniently ignored contemporary scientific consensus that put the Earth's circumference at a much greater span. For him, the distance from Europe to Asia, sailing west, was a mere 2,400 nautical miles. A manageable, if challenging, voyage, the actual distance closer. A difference so monumental it bordered on the comical, had the stakes not been so incredibly high. This wasn't merely a factual error, it was the foundation of his entire existence, the bedrock of his dream. His conviction was absolute. It was a madness, perhaps, but a madness tempered by an unshakable faith in his own flawed numbers. He was like a man staring at a map with a known destination, except imagine the scene: a humble mariner, his clothes perhaps a little worn, standing before the erudite scholars, the cautious monarchs, the skeptical courtiers. He spoke with a fervor bordering on the evangelical, presenting his charts, his figures, his unshakable conviction. The learned men of Salamanca, the finest minds of Spain, listened, then shook their heads. "The earth is indeed round, Master Columbus, but it is far, far larger than your estimations. Such a journey would be prohibitively long. Your ships would run out of provisions, your crew would perish. You would sail off the edge of the known world for all practical purposes." They were right, of course. Based on the correct understanding of the Earth's size, his plan was suicidal. Yet Columbus, a man whose arrogance was, he saw their wisdom as timidity, their caution as a lack of vision. He saw himself as a prophet, a chosen instrument, destined for glory. This wasn't just about trade routes. It was about destiny, about God's will, about an almost messianic zeal. His motivation wasn't purely scientific or economic. It was deeply personal, imbued with a spiritual fervor that made him. He wandered from court to court, from Portugal to Spain, a man possessed. He was rejected by King John II of Portugal, who ironically sent his own secret expedition west, only to have them turn back in terror when the ocean stretched endlessly before them. Columbus was scorned, dismissed as a fantasist, a charlatan, his grand scheme ridiculed. His hair turned grey, his face weathered, but the fire in his eyes remained undimmed. He clung to his numbers, his maps, his conviction, like a drowning man to a spar, He simply could not, would not, believe he was wrong. This stubbornness, this almost pathological belief in his own flawed arithmetic, was precisely what would launch him into the annals of history. It was the crucial variable in his Spain, a newly unified kingdom under the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, had just achieved a monumental victory, the reconquest of Granada, expelling the last Moorish stronghold from the Iberian Peninsula. It was a moment of triumph, but also one of immense financial strain and a desperate need for new avenues of wealth. Portugal, their rival, dominated the lucrative sea routes around Africa to the east, controlling the flow of spices and silks that fueled Europe's economy. Spain needed its own path to prosperity, its own slice of the global pie. And then there was Columbus again. Still there, still pleading, still convinced. This time, however, the political landscape had shifted. Isabella, perhaps it was a gamble, but what did Spain have to lose? A few ships, a few men, against the potential for unimaginable riches, a direct route to the mythical East. The alternative was stagnation, forever playing second fiddle to Portugal. The risk, though immense, suddenly seemed worth considering. The final negotiations were tense, almost collapsing several times. Columbus, despite his humble origins, demanded extravagant terms, governorship of any lands discovered, a tenth of all revenues, and the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. His audacity was breathtaking. Who was this man, this vagabond mariner, to demand such terms from royalty? But Isabella, perhaps sensing the man's unyielding spirit, perhaps desperate, 3 small ships, the Santa Mafia, the Pinta, and the Naya were prepared. 87 men, a mix of hardened sailors, landlubbers, and even a few criminals seeking pardons, were assembled. Most embarked with a mixture of fear and trepidation. They were sailing into the great unknown, beyond the edge of their known maps, towards a destiny none could truly comprehend. The air was thick with superstition, whispers of sea monsters, boiling oceans, and the dreaded thought of falling off the flat earth. But Columbus, standing tall on the deck of the Santa Mafia, was resolute. His compass pointed west towards what he believed was Asia, just a few weeks' sail away. His confidence, though built on a foundation of sand, was infectious, or at least the sails caught the wind, the ships glided out of the harbor, and soon the familiar coastline of Spain disappeared from view. The blue horizon, once a comforting line, now stretched into an endless, terrifying expanse. The voyage began for days, then weeks they sailed. The known world receded, replaced by the vast, undulating wilderness of the Atlantic. The initial excitement, the fresh water dwindled, the food grew stale, and the men grew restless. How much farther, Admiral? The cries would begin hushed at first, then growing bolder. Columbus, ever the master of deception and encouragement, would point to a flock of birds, a change in the wind, a wisp of cloud. Land is near. He would declare, his voice ringing with conviction he may or may not have truly felt. But day after day, the horizon remained an unbroken line of blue meeting blue. The sun rose and set in monotonous repetition, painting the sky with glorious colors that did little to soothe the growing dread in the sailors' hearts. The logbook, carefully maintained by Columbus, often showed inflated distances traveled, a deliberate ploy to reassure his crew, or perhaps to reassure himself. He was, in effect, performing a psychological tightrope walk, balancing hope and fear, faith and mutiny. The true terror was not of falling off the world, but of being stranded in its vast, indifferent embrace, slowly starving, slowly dehydrating, adrift on an endless sea. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, blossoming into open challenges. "We will sail no—" Some men shouted, their faces gaunt, their eyes wild with desperation. "This is madness. We are doomed." The threat of mutiny hung heavy in the salty air, a phantom ship trailing their meager fleet. Columbus knew he was treading a dangerous line. He had promised land, a swift journey to the east, but the weeks had turned into a month. Then more, his own calculations, so stubbornly held, yet he would not yield. He spoke of God's providence, of the glory awaiting them, of the riches that would make them legends. He was a master orator when he needed to be painting vivid pictures of golden cities and exotic spices. He was also a stern disciplinarian, ready to quell any dissent with an iron fist. The crew, caught between their fear of the unknown and their fear of their resolute, the suspense was unbearable. Each dawn brought a fresh wave of hope, each sunset a crushing return of despair. They saw floating branches, migrating birds, cloud formations that mimicked distant shores. Each time the cry of terror land would ring out, only to be followed by the crushing realization that it was another mirage, another cruel trick of the sea. Imagine the psychological toll, the constant cycle of hope and disappointment, the gnawing hunger, the thirst for fresh water, the endless creaking of the ship, the vast empty expanse. It was a crucible designed to break men's spirits, to drive them to the brink of madness. Columbus himself must have felt the immense pressure, the weight of his gamble, the lives of his men resting on his flawed. Did a sliver of fear pierce his iron resolve, perhaps, but he never showed it. He was the admiral, the leader, the man with the unwavering vision, however flawed that vision might be. Then, on the night of the 11th of October, after over 2 months at sea, a small flickering light was spotted in the distance, a tiny beacon of hope against the impenetrable darkness. It was barely visible, a fleeting. At 2 a.m. on the 12th of October, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, aboard the Pinta, shouted the long-awaited cry, "Fee tierra! Fee tierra! A la vista! Land at last!" The jubilation that erupted was explosive. Cathartic tears flowed, men embraced, prayers were uttered, and the fear that had gripped them for so long dissipated in an instant. They had not sailed off the edge of the world. They had found land. A new dawn broke, revealing a lush green island, bathed in the soft light of morning. It was not the barren monster, infested wasteland of their nightmares, but a verdant paradise, teeming with life. Columbus, dressed in his finest clothes, stepped ashore, knelt, and claimed the land for Spain, naming it San Sal. He was convinced he had reached the outermost islands of the East Indies, a precursor to the grand continent of Asia. He met the indigenous people, who were, to his European eyes, unlike any he had ever seen. They were peaceful, curious, and adorned with gold ornaments. Gold, the precious metal that had fueled his dreams and driven his gamble. He called them Indians, a testament to his This simple act of naming, rooted in his geographical era, would profoundly shape the history of these people and the continent they inhabited. He searched for the Grand Khan, for the fabled cities of Cathay, for the bustling ports of Cipango. He meticulously described the flora and fauna, the customs of the natives, all through the lens of his unwavering belief that he was on the cusp. Every palm tree was a sign of the Orient, every native village a prelude to imperial splendor. He was actively, stubbornly fitting a new reality into his old, flawed map. He sailed onward, exploring more islands, Cuba and Hispaniola among them. He continued to search for signs of a sophisticated Asian civilization, for the spice trade, for the evidence that would validate his hypothesis. Yet, he never wavered in his belief. His miscalculation wasn't just geographical, it was perceptual. He saw what he expected to see, not what was truly there. The beautiful, diverse cultures he encountered were, to him, merely primitive inhabitants of the outer reaches of a known world, not the sophisticated societies of a vast, entirely unknown continent. He returned to Spain triumphant, heralded as a hero, a visionary who had opened a new route to the east. The royal court was ecstatic. Spain had its path to riches, its answer to Portugal's dominance. Columbus presented his findings. Spices he vaguely identified, gold ornaments, and most powerfully, a group of indigenous people, living proof of his journey to the Indies. But the truth, the colossal, world-shaking truth, was slowly beginning to emerge, not from Columbus's own revelations, but from the cumulative evidence of subsequent voyages and the keen observations of others. What Columbus had found was not Asia, but an entirely new landmass, a colossal barrier between Europe and the East. a continent previously unknown to the European. This wasn't a discovery of the intended destination. It was the accidental stumble upon a world-altering detour. His insane gamble had paid off, but in a way he never foresaw, never acknowledged, and arguably never truly understood. The simple miscalculation of the Earth's circumference had fundamentally altered the outcome. Had his numbers been correct, had the Earth been as small as he believed, he would have run out of supplies hundreds of miles before reaching land, and his expedition would have been a forgotten tragedy. But because he was so profoundly, gloriously wrong, his journey, though far longer and more arduous than he anticipated, was just long enough to bridge the gap to a previously unimagined land. The miscalculation didn't merely lead to discovery. It created the conditions for the discovery of a new continent, forcing Europe to confront a geographical reality far grander and more complex than its own maps could ever encompass. Columbus made 3 more voyages across the Atlantic, never once relinquishing his belief that he was exploring the fringes of Asia. He died in 1506, still convinced he had reached the East Indies, a tragic figure clinging to his delusion even as others, like Amerigo Vespucci, began to grasp the true magnitude of what had been found. Vespucci's detailed accounts of these new lands, describing them as a new world separate from Asia, eventually led to the continent being named America in his honor. A bitter irony for Columbus, whose grand miscalculation effectively handed the naming rights to another. The legacy of Columbus is, as you know, complex and deeply contested. He was a man of extraordinary courage, unparalleled determination, and a navigational skill that was, despite his geographical errors, remarkable. Yet, he was also a figure whose arrival marked the beginning of immense suffering for the indigenous populations, the brutal conquest and colonization that forever changed their world. He sought gold and glory and found a continent. He sought a shortcut to the east, and instead forged an entirely new global connection. His insane gamble, born from a simple miscalculation, didn't just open a sea route. It shattered the existing world order, initiated the Columbian Exchange, and set in motion the forces that would shape modern geopolitics, economics, and cultures. The story of Columbus isn't just about a journey across an ocean. It is a profound lesson in the unpredictable nature of history, where monumental achievements can spring from colossal errors, where unwavering belief can override inconvenient facts, and where the human drive for discovery, however flawed its initial premise, can reshape the very planet we inhabit. It is a testament to the power of a single, unwavering will, even if the world was forever changed, not because Columbus was right about where he was going, but because he was so spectacularly wrong, yet stubbornly refused to turn back. His miscalculation was the catalyst, the spark that ignited a new era, inadvertently creating a new continent in the European consciousness. The land was always there, of course, vibrant and ancient, but for Europe, it might as well have been. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest leaps forward aren't made by those with perfect knowledge, but by those with an audacious, almost reckless determination to push past the known, even if their internal maps are completely off. His simple miscalculation wasn't simple at all. It was the crucial pivot point, the blind spot that paradoxically illuminated an entire hemisphere. That is all for today's video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.